Now, you were born and raised in California.
Yes.
Spent most of your formative years there.
Yeah.
Whereabouts were you born? I forget.
I was born in Sacramento.
Uh-huh.
And then moved around a lot. Back to Sacramento. Went to high school, 3 different places in there. Tyson High School in Sacramento, Angels Camp, actually Aldaville, small mining town, California. So sort of more or less from this mining town, Calvert County, California.
And it was actually the Army that got you to college, so to speak?
The Army got me to college by saying, sign here and we'll send you to medical school.
Huh.
So I said, I guess I'll be a doctor, and I signed up.
You were in high school at the time?
I hadn't graduated. I had enough units to graduate, but I was senior high school. So then they decided they didn't need doctors as much as they needed engineers. So I said, okay, then I'll be an engineer. So that
the signature
engineering
was good for both, either a doctor or an engineer.
They
apparently.
didn't care.
Yeah.
But after those 2 quarters I mentioned in Stanford, they said, well, we don't need doctors or engineers quite so much as we need infantrymen.
Aha.
So that's how I became an infantryman.
And you went overseas?
Yes. Went to Pacific Theater. Went to Okinawa and stayed about a year or so in Korea.
We had talked a little bit about your directorship at NCCD, but suddenly you picked up stakes and moved back east.
It was fairly sudden.
It was sudden. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how you came to Rutgers University.
Well, I got a letter in the mail from Vice President for Academic Affairs saying they had this job and are you interested? Somebody had nominated me, I guess. Well, I didn't really know where New Jersey was exactly.
Actually, I can tell you now it was not me that
You didn't?
I wasn't.
No. And so I don't know. I wasn't very interested, but I thought, well, I was going back to Philadelphia as an advisor for a project Marvin Wolf. And when I looked at the map, I saw that Philadelphia was not very far from New Brunswick, which is where this letter came from. So I thought, why not? I'll talk with them. So I did that. I got off the train, and there was a lady and a little girl standing there, and I thought they were waiting for their ride home, so I thought they knew the area. And I said, well, excuse me, but how would you go to New Brunswick, New Jersey? And she looked at me and said, I wouldn't
go there.
So but I did find out how to get there. And after meeting new people and learning about the chance to develop a new program, I was interested in it. And just at that time, you may recall that you had moved to Albany and in a criminal justice program. And your older brothers, Gary and Stephen, both had moved to Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University.
So it wouldn't be too far off the mark to say that I'm the cause of the creation of the school at Rutgers in the way that it took.
It's very tricky, but you would not get by.
I see. You mentioned a project. Do you remember the project that Marvin was working on? That you were.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us what it is?
Yes, the project was about evaluation of research in criminology. And we all got there. He paid us a substantial sum of money, and we sat around the table and advised him not to do it. It couldn't be done. He since has published it.
He did it anyway to publish the book, and it became a famous book. Well, that was good advice. So you agreed to take a job in a school that didn't exist.
Exactly.
And what happened next?
Well, I had a nice year of trying to plan the school with a lot of support from the president. Support given also by the fact that the legislature had passed an act, which incidentally was word for word matching the act in New York that created the School of Criminal Justice at the State University of New York at Albany.
What a coincidence.
Written by the same person.
I see.
Yeah, just a couple of years later. So there's this act that said the university will develop such a school. And that was a big help. And I had a you know, I could have hired a faculty and put off having students for about a year probably to plan the program. But I didn't do that because your colleagues up there at SUNY had just done that for a year. You had these leading scholars sitting around. I see them now drinking coffee and Hans smoking a cigar, planning this out. So I just copied what they did at the State University of Albany, pretty much, in terms of the general structure of the program and some of the courses. And I think it worked out well for quite a while with G's now.
So that is the 4 substantive areas of study.
The five areas, yeah, same as Albany's, essentially made different names. It's you know, take it.
Why don't we pause while you repair your equipment here?
Sorry. Got so excited.
Got so excited. Yeah, this is.
You get that? Does it stop with that?
It's hard to sit still. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don, that plate right in front of you is a microphone.
Oh, this is?
Yeah. Yeah, so you're going like this with your hands on it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going like this?
Yeah, you're polishing the table.
Oh.
Okay.
I think it's just a coincidence. He was always doing it when I was speaking. That's all right.
Okay,
So
where were we?
We were in the creation of the school at Rutgers. How did you go about recruiting a faculty? What happened there? You certainly hired a lot of famous and distinguished people.
I can't recall now who was the first, but it might have been Gerhard Mueller. I had known Gerhard only from meetings of an organization that still meets occasionally, I think, called the Directors of Research Institutes in Criminology, United States and Canada. And I'd met Gerhard at those meetings because at the time I knew him then, he was at New York University Law School and had a research enterprise. And then later from his United Nations work. And I think that I recruited him first, but only half-time, because he was still working with the United Nations and agreed to do that as a half-time position. Then I think another first, probably the second one, was David Twain, who I've known because of his work in the National Institute of Mental Health, Criminology Center, which he invented and directed. So he knew about government and knew about grant funding and so forth. So I recruited Dave. He was teaching over in New York somewhere. And then I found Jim Finkenauer, who was a full professor at Trenton State College with tenure. Enticed him to come to Rutgers as an associate on a contract. And they were promised that great things would come of our school, and he did. And I feel relieved now that that worked out fine, because he's become famous professor.
Right.
And then Frida Adler was recruited about the same time.
Now,
She was living in Philadelphia.
she was teaching at school.
Was she?
Andrew was teaching at SUNY Albany, I think, at the time.
He was. Andrew came about a year or maybe 2 later.
Andrew von Hirsch.
Andrew von Hirsch, thank you very much, yes. Because I knew about his work up there in Albany. He was visiting, I think, for a year or 2 at Albany.
I remember I had a class from.
Yeah. And I'm sure you learned a lot.
Yes. One of us learned quite a lot.
I'll bet you learned too. So I was able to recruit Andrew for our program as well, and I left out Dick Sparks.
Oh, that's right.
Dick Sparks has been an assistant director of research in the criminology program at Cambridge. Although he's an American, he lived in England quite a long while. And I knew of his work. He had a quite well-known book called
Surveying Victims.
No, Surveying Victims was still in press.
Oh,
It
you
was-
meant
it
Hood
was
Sparks,
done.
Key Issues in Criminology.
Key Issues in Criminology is the one I had read.
That's right.
But I knew about his survey work too, and it was at a time in this country when that work was becoming very important too. And recruited Dick Sparks into the program, so I had a leading person for the law area, a leading person for the research area, leading person for planning and evaluation, leading person in the sociology and criminology area, leading person in gym, sort of an all-around person who also knew about New Jersey and worked in the state planning, been responsible for it in New Jersey, knew the state well, and so forth. As a state university, I've always felt we had a responsibility to the state and the country to make contributions, even to the state, although I know there are differences in opinion about that.
Sure. That's really a remarkable faculty they've created.
I thought so, and I do still think so.
No regrets. No regrets. So you had a legislatively mandated school. You had a distinguished faculty. So why did you go out and get students? You had it all.
We had it all. And you know, we didn't really have very much pressure for FTEs or student, and we didn't for quite a long time. It's nice to have students around because, as you know, you learn from students.
Makes it more of a
And if you
college
didn't,
atmosphere.
it would be sort of like how nice it would be to just keep working in corrections if you didn't have to have those inmates.
Right.
But it's a good idea to have some students for a lot of reasons.
You've had an awful lot of good ones over the years.
We've had a lot of great students, and we've tried in the school to follow a little bit of additional advice that I received from, again, your colleague Ansel Larry, who later became president of the state university.
That's right.
He was dean there for a time after I knew him and worked with him.
That's right.
But he told me there are only 3 ways a school can survive in a university. You either have to be cost effective, or you have to have centrality, or you have to have quality. Well, it's obvious that, see, there's no way a criminal justice program can have centrality. You don't have to have a criminal justice program in university. There's no way it can be cost effective. You can't make a lot of money. You have to have quality. So we've proceeded on that basis with some success for quite a long while in Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. Now we are teaching more undergraduates. We're taking on, did take on an undergraduate program now in Newark College of Arts and Sciences. So that's changing somewhat with more undergraduate teaching, which I believe you'll agree is a good thing.
I'm absolutely convinced that it
I know
is.
that you are, because I know how anxious you are to get professors into undergraduate teaching, which I agree with.
But the idea was to build a high-quality unit and then defend it on those terms within the university.
Defend it as a quality program. I think that was my point.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the students that have passed through since you were dean there?
I could. I couldn't name them all, but I'll tell you, just last night we had a reception, and the chair of the reception was Jay Albanese, who is the president of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences at the meeting that we're attending this week. He happens to be the first graduate of our master's program, first graduate of our doctoral program, first chairman of the Student Association, first chairman of the Alumni Association. He seems to have a compulsion to be first, but he does it all very well. His program director for this meeting was Lee Ross, who is a more recent alumnus of ours. I don't know how many more you want me to mention, but they are now around the country teaching in universities and colleges, and doing research, and making fine contributions. They should have. They'll continue to do so no matter what we do to them.
That's right. You should have mentioned that the faculty there includes 3 presidents of the American Society of Criminology. Is that correct?
Well, that's true, counting me, because the earliest one was Gerhard Mueller.
Gerhard.
And then I was president, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. And this most recent year, Frida Adler was president, who incidentally married Gerhard Mueller after the time we were speaking of, after he came to our school. Gerhard called me up one day from Reno and said, Dean, I just want to tell you 40% of your faculty just married one another.
So that's another thing that you created while you
I created a family.
Yes, you did. Yeah. We won't pick up on that segue. Yeah, actually, it's said that you're the father of many things in criminology. But clearly the most important is the guidelines movement. Talk a little bit about that. Where did that come from?
Well, you know, it actually came, trace it back enough and in detail, it came from that uniform parole report.
Mm-hmm. How so?
Well, as you mentioned, we had collected a large set of data about parolees. And as you also mentioned, technology was not what we have today. It was unusual to have a meeting in Chicago, which we did, with those data for 100,000 or so offenders, with some follow-up data on file at Lockheed Laboratories down in the Bay Area, with a modem there in the hotel room in Chicago, screen, hooked up and able to use the dialogue program invented at Lockheed, which is used mainly, as you know, for text retrieval, abstract retrieval. We were using it to find numbers, subsets where there were words or numbers, so we were using it that way. And we had this program in Chicago where we could have in the audience, which is parole board people, raise hypotheses about parolees and we could test them by calling up the data. That was very intriguing to the audience. The meeting went well. One of the people in the audience was Walter Dunbar. Walter Dunbar had just been the chairman of the United States Parole Board. And I'd known him in California because I worked for him. He was deputy director of corrections. So he was very intrigued by that and thought in the U.S. Parole Board they needed to have an information system technology like that. He convinced George Reed, who was then chairman, that they ought to do something along that line and to give me a call. So he called me. Actually, we were invited. I was invited first to do that, do some work with them toward developing their information. So I agreed with George Reed to do that. I thought, okay, now I've got a problem. How am I going to survive this? Besides trying to get a grant, but I thought probably we could get some money if the federal parole board wanted to do this. So I called up Leslie, who was then at Albany, and asked him to collaborate, which proves to have been a very good move. And so Leslie and I put in a proposal to NIJ, now it's NIJ, to do that study in collaboration with the parole board. The intent was, as I just mentioned, to improve their information for decision making.
And they're very action-oriented piece of research.
Action-oriented, but their focus was in how can a computer help us? Well, we didn't think it would help all that much unless they knew what they were trying to do in making decisions, unless they formulated some general policy. And we thought probably the prediction stuff would be relevant to that. We had a seminar with them over, I think, 2 days in a remote location, explaining this stuff and how we do it, that kind of activity. And we began talking with them in this vein that people like yourselves make two kinds of decisions. First, you make those individual case decisions. But secondly, you make general policy decisions that set the framework within which the individual decision is made. And they said, no, we don't. We said, we don't have a general policy. And they were adamant that they didn't have a general policy. Well, we had kind of a problem here because we thought we were supposed to help them develop.
You had this great conceptual escape, and they were denying it right there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Fortunately, Congressman Katzenmeyer was in the House, and he was having a committee that was complaining that the parole board didn't have a general policy, making all these decisions. And there's a psychiatrist also wrote a book at the time in which he made the same complaint. That didn't affect them very much, but some other things happened. We did a small study with their collaboration of the youth division cases with those members that just made decisions on the youth division cases. We started there because the young offenders in the federal system at that time, I don't know if it's still the case, they had a sentence that's called zip 6. Nothing to 6 years. He determined within those bounds. And the parole board would determine how long they stay in the institution. So it's kind of simple way it began, and we began by working up a little questionnaire in collaboration with the board members that they had completed the time that they made the determination. They did that for some substantial number of cases, and then we looked at those data, came back to them and said, well, it looks as if at the first appearance before you can predict reasonably well from your ratings whether or not you'll parole on the basis of a few items.
So you could predict their decisions.
Predicting their decision from how serious they thought the crime was, what they thought the risk was, and what they thought the institutional adjustment was. But mainly the first two. Or institutional progress, program progress. But those latter two are so highly correlated. So we presented that to them and said, well, you know, maybe it's your policy to consider the seriousness of the crime, the risk of the offender, and institutional adjustment. One of the board members said, you know, that's what it says in the law that we're supposed to do, which is bad. At the same time that was going on, so they were starting to think maybe we do have a policy, the law there's these data. They were having an increasing workload problem, and they're going to hire a number of hearing representatives. These hearing representatives would have an important decision-making role in this process, and the board would have a lesser one, but maybe they'd have more of a role as general policy fixers. So over this time, they came around to the belief that one of their jobs is indeed to set general policy, and that provided then a receptivity and framework for the notion of guidelines, which came about just by looking at the data on who was paroled in terms of dimensions such as the seriousness of the offense and the risk. The risk measure we call salient factors, for the simple reason that Walter Dunbar, the person I mentioned, kept asking us to get up on the computer the salient factors.
Oh, I see.
So when we had a risk measure and didn't know what to call it, we said, well, we'll help out Walter Dunbar, we'll call it the salient factors.
Could have been called the Dunbar scale, and
Could very well.
history would have taken a different course.
So that's how we came up with guidelines in the federal parole board system, and then we thought that was a pretty successful thing. We applied for a grant to further that work with some other parole boards, and also to talk about the conceptualization with a group of judges to see whether a similar thing might be developed in sentencing. Not the same model, but a similar approach. And so we made a proposal to NIJ. We met with them. They were interested in both, but they said, you know, we've got a desk over here that deals with parole corrections. We've got a different desk over here that deals with sentencing. So we need two proposals. Can't be done with one. And we argued a little bit and said, you know, it's the same problem. Everybody's sentencing. Parole boards are sentencing judges. They said, no, I'll get two different desks. So we made two proposals and asked them for somewhat more money. It's just the way we spend money, I guess. And they gave us those two grants, and so we said, what do we do? So we decided I would take the leading role for the one with the parole boards in different states. We had 6 or 8 states to work with. Leslie would take the leading role in the sentencing part and do that mainly from Albany. I would do the other part mainly from Newark. And we get together from time to time and collaborate, so that's what we did.
And subsequently, the many parole boards adopted these. Do you know how many?
I don't know how many, Michael. A large number.
The United States Parole Commission ultimately did.
Quite a number of states. We worked with about 8 states. Most of them adopted some form of guidelines, directly coming from that study, not all of them. Other states, such as Minnesota, adopted parole guidelines, and they were not involved in the study.
But the innovation clearly diffused very quickly throughout many parts of the criminal justice system.
Well, in parole, not universal, and I don't know how universal it is now. but it was fairly promptly adopted in parole, not so fast in sentencing. In sentencing, guidelines were developed from that conceptualization, but usually more indirectly. For example, the one in Minnesota, the guidelines in Minnesota were some of the most famous guidelines. Clearly the model is the same, the model we had there for parole, and our model with sentencing we had for Colorado. But it came about because I said because it came about after the person
It's hard to avoid the language.
It is hard to avoid. The person who was research director for parole and developed the parole guidelines became the director for the Sentencing Guidelines Commission established in Minnesota. And brought the same model to their discussions in the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. But it was a rather different model. Theoretically, that is, it did not develop from data as a starting point, so much as developing from an attention first to the theory of what you're trying to do. That commission developed a model more after a deserved theory of punishment.
Now, this model of making policy explicit from the implicit decisions that people are making and surfacing those factors, that has not been without its critics.
No, it has not. You'd like to know what the critics say?
I know what they say. I'd like to know what you have to say about it.
Oh, what did they say?
Well, let's see. They're rigid. They ossify past practice. Why should you have computers making decisions that human beings should be involved in? As a start.
Yeah. Those criticisms usually reveal that the person making those criticisms doesn't understand the concept or the evidence bearing on those issues. There is good evidence presented in an article that you and I wrote together in the Illinois Law Review, or a book like that, trying to refute that. The evidence shows that certainly it does not freeze past practice. The criticism shows a lack of understanding of what it is we're trying to do in doing those things, which is give a process and a basis for an evolutionary development, change in the system rather than freezing. So a complete, misunderstanding of that attitude and concept. And so is the idea of letting a computer make the decisions, or the title of one of the critics you have in mind, I think it was called Sentencing by Mathematics. In my opinion, you don't have to read that article, just read the title. If it's Sentencing by Mathematics, it's not what we were about. We were very careful to attend to issues of a good and healthy, proper use of discretion where it could be useful. So most of those criticisms, I think, show that either the person doesn't understand the concept or they haven't read the literature.
You've generally been pursuing what you refer to as a rational decision-making framework. Could you describe that a little bit? And then we'll talk about some of its critics.
Yes. I might have to quote from the book that you and I have together with those words in the subtitle. Generally, that conceptualization is that decisions are made throughout the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. In fact, decision-making gives one very useful way of viewing those systems for a lot of reasons. It's sort of, one could say that decision-making is the stuff of the criminal justice system. Yet we're making these decisions. Most people agree that those decisions ought to be rational, whatever that means. People have different ideas about what that means. There's no necessity that a decision be rational. You can't prove that it should be. But you may have a preference for a rational decision. If you look at what a rational decision is, one conceptualization is that it's that decision which selects the alternative that maximizes the likelihood of attainment of an objective that the decision maker has. So that decision has three parts. Has some goal or goals, has some alternatives, some choices, and has some information. Those are the three parts of a decision. Can easily be argued that any one of those parts is missing, you don't have a decision problem. If you don't know what the goal is, you don't have a problem with a decision. At least you can hardly consider it a rational decision. If you don't have any alternatives, it means there are no choices, no decision. If you have no information, you wouldn't want to be discussing a rational decision. You might as well behave like we do in this casino hotel and put your money on a number. So there's three parts of the decision. Information, well, it helps to provide a framework for the notion that we really need to be clear about the objectives of decisions. We need to examine the alternatives or invent new ones or whatever. What are the choices? And we need to examine the information. It's important to point out that information does not mean mere data, no matter how reliable or carefully collected. Information is those data that reduce uncertainty in the decision. Because these are data that are relevant to the choice of the alternatives. So much of our job is doing just that, defining objectives, looking at the alternatives, and particularly improving information that will help make more rational decisions. And you and I have tried to show that that notion can be followed through the criminal justice system. And we've done some work showing that that can be a useful attitude in the juvenile justice system. Some of that work we've done together. So that's a model that I think is a useful one and maybe helpful.
I want to just return just for a moment to the creation of the School of Criminal Justice. All of the faculty, since there were no schools of criminal justice, there one just that started in Albany, but there were no products of those schools. All of the faculty from the School of Criminal Justice were from the various disciplines: law, psychology, sociology, and you and others helped create a new model, a different model, whereby people would not be trained in the disciplines, but they would be trained in criminal justice. And what do you think about that model?
Yeah. By the way, we quickly came around to the point of hiring two graduates of the State University of New York Albany School of Criminal Justice in the persons of Todd Kinnear and Jake Gibbs. Both probably in school around the time.
Both colleagues of mine, sure.
Colleagues
Yeah.
in school.
Yeah.
Who have,
And I'm not going to tell any of the stories I could tell about either of those two while we're in graduate school. So
Good idea.
you might as well just keep talking.
Good idea. When I came there to Rutgers, I thought, well, it's not a discipline. It's not a discipline of criminal justice. But I was always talking about it as a problem area. And we would have an interdisciplinary team examining a problem area. And I still think there's value to that model, but we do have more and more education now with graduate programs in criminal justice. And, although I said there's no discipline like that, maybe that's wrong now. Even though it might have been right then, maybe there is a discipline of criminal justice. I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
The crime rate today is roughly 3 times higher than it was when you started the School of Criminal Justice.
Yes, it is. Is that a question? Did we cause the crime rate?
Did you? You certainly haven't seemed to cause it to have gone down any.
That's right. I've learned from you that the first thing to look at, if you're interested in the crime rate, is not schools of criminal justice and their development, but at the age distribution of crime and the way the population age groups change over time. And I'm fairly well convinced from what you've taught me that a pretty good predictor of crime rates are those age distributions.
Was age a factor in that base expectancy?
Yes. Ordinarily age is a fairly good predictor. Wherever you go in that study or in other studies, if you have something about the offense, something about prior record and age, you have most of the variability you can account for. You might get a little bit more from drug use or alcohol, so something of that sort, but those three are typically found. So, yeah, age is a good predictor.
Now, you recently retired from Rutgers.
Yes, I did.
And relocated in California.
Yes, I did.
Back to Sacramento, California.
Yes, I did.
Talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
Now, well, I've been working with some folks in Arizona. Recently did an evaluation of a program down there that's a statewide program defined by the legislature that it is a diversion program from the rest of the system. It has various treatment programs as components, and this was an empirical evaluation of that using data that they've collected there in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
So I just finished doing that. I have an NIJ grant.
Yet another grant.
Yet another grant.
These early
to study.
predictors seem to be fairly stable
Yeah.
throughout the life course.
That's right. I've read that in some of your books. This is a study of sentencing in New Jersey.
Uh-huh.
It's another follow-up study. It's an interesting study because I have data that the judges gave me. We collaborated with the judges there. They filled out a questionnaire at the time of sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's rather interesting because they give their purposes of sentencing, they give their judgments about the risk of the offenders and some other predictions and so forth. And now we have nearly 20 years follow-up for those individuals, and we're busy just now starting to code the arrest records and other records there in New Jersey.
And I understand you're writing another book.
I'm working on a book. It's called A Primer of Criminal Justice, be a small book.
Uh-huh. So this will be a book that will be available in about a year for, what would you say, about $12.95 from, did you want to mention?
I'd say about the time this tape is available,
This book
probably
will
look
be
in your bookstores.
bookstores all over the country.
Pick it up.
Very good. We may have used up our time a lot.
Oh, however you want to do.
This will be edited.
Absolutely. No, it depends if there's any other questions you have, Michael.
My name is Michael Gottfredson. I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, and I'm here to interview my father, Don M. Gottfredson, professor emeritus at Rutgers University. Dad, why don't we start by describing your educational background. You went to undergraduate school at the University of California?
Yes, I did. I went to Stanford for a couple of quarters. I was in the Army at the time, Army Reserve. And then later on I did go to Berkeley, and I graduated in psychology from University of California at Berkeley. And then I went to Claremont Graduate School in Southern California in psychology, and have MA and PhD from Claremont.
What kind of psychology were you intending to study at Claremont?
Well, at Claremont they really didn't have kinds of psychology. They thought there was only one psychology. They did have a clinical program, and I was in the clinical program. But actually, I was very interested in things like history and systems of psychology and perception and learning.
What did you do your dissertation on?
It was about memory.
Do you remember anything about it?
I've forgotten the details, but yeah, it was about
Was
memory.
apparently not a memorable dissertation.
Not particularly.
So how did you come to be involved in criminal justice if you were interested in memory and psychology?
Oh, I was interested really in psychology, and I was in graduate school. Had to earn a living, so I'd been working as a social worker with aid to needy children and old age assistance program and so forth. Didn't pay very well, and I learned about a job in the Department of Corrections in California. And I obtained that job. It was called a Correctional Classification Officer, but that was just the job title. It was really doing group counseling with inmates in the reception center at Chino, where they received inmates from the county jails, of course mostly Los Angeles, into the prison system to start their prison terms.
I seem to remember that Chino was somehow innovative in those days. Was it a new?
Both the Institution for Men at Chino and the Reception Guidance Center were thought of as quite innovative. The institution itself, I didn't work there, but it was known very well as one of the best minimum custody institutions when that was still kind of an innovation. The Reception Guidance Center was one of two in California at the time. They had another one at San Quentin. But the purpose was a study of the offenders coming to prison over about an 8 or 10 week period, fairly intensive study of each individual with a staff decision then about recommendations for their treatment and custody program in corrections. So that got me interested in corrections. With those inmates, 6 hours a day, groups of inmates, about 3 groups a day, 20, 30 inmates every day for 6 hours. We did that for about 3 years.
So those counseling sessions with inmates seem to have had a big effect on you. Did it have any effect on them, as far as you know?
Well, there's this one guy who was an organized crime character of some renown. He was an enforcer, and he was only in my group for about 3 weeks, when in the middle of the night he was picked up and taken to Folsom Prison because there was a rumor that he was going to try to escape. And 20 years later, he became an informer for the FBI. So I figure you have to study these things for a long time, Michael.
Yeah.
After 20 years, the guy was reformed.
Well, so
and that was only 3 weeks in my...
important to have a long follow-up on.
Long follow-up.
Yes, yes. Well, were there any particular professors at Claremont or at Berkeley that you think might have had an influence on?
Sure, both. Of course, at Berkeley, well, my advisor was a professor named Nevitt Sanford. I never had classes from him, but I admired his work a whole lot, and he, of course, was very influential because he was interested. He was a clinical psychologist, but he was very interested in what Kurt Levine had called action research. For example, he has an interesting article. This is 30 years ago now, his article titled Whatever Happened to Action Research, which is kind of a good title now, in my opinion. So he and a Professor McKinnon, others there. At Claremont, my major advisor was a man named Ted Perkins, who I admired very much. And he influenced me a lot, I think, in terms of, well, psychology, but more philosophy. He was just a very interesting, smart guy, and his seminars were just wonderful in terms of history of philosophy and history of psychology and all. And his general conceptualizations certainly influenced me a lot.
How about down at Claremont?
At Claremont?
What was that?
That was Ted Perkins at Claremont,
He was
yeah.
at Claremont.
Yeah. My main clinical professor was a woman named Florence Mateer, who influenced me a lot in terms of clinical psychology. She was the first female clinical psychologist in America.
Oh, is that right?
And she was an older lady while I was there, fairly older lady.
So you did actually get a clinical, is it a clinical degree or a clinical license?
Well, that's it. It's just one degree, but I did have the clinical program, clinical internship, which I had at in corrections at the Reception Guidance Center.
And then when you left Claremont, where did you go?
Left Claremont and the Department of Corrections and went to what was called then Fresno State College, California State University of Fresno now,
Mhm.
as an instructor in psychology.
Mhm.
I taught psychology for 2 years there,
Mhm.
and an opportunity arose in the Department of Corrections that appealed to me because they were just starting a research division,
Mhm.
which was unusual, still fairly unusual, I'm afraid.
Now, what year was this?
That would be
Must have
about
been.
1957, probably. And they had a guy named Doug Grant as chief of research. And I was interested in doing research in corrections, and so I left teaching psychology and went back to corrections, but in the research division
Uh-huh.
to help Doug establish that unit.
Mhm.
So I did that for a few years.
So you moved to Sacramento then?
I moved to Davis.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
moved to Davis.
But the job was in Sacramento,
Yes.
was it not? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
One of us is. And so how long did you stay there?
With the Department of Corrections?
Uh-huh.
Stayed 3 years, I think, something like that, in the Department of Corrections in the research division.
Mhm.
Then I was fortunate to get an NIMH grant to study methods development for evaluation studies in corrections
Mhm.
from NIMH. And it was not a very substantial grant, certainly not by today's standards, but helped for about 3 years to establish a unit at the California Medical Facility, which is a psychiatric hospital facility for corrections in
Mhm.
California.
Mhm.
And with the help of others, of course, I developed a research unit there of inmate workers. So we had a coding section, a statistics section, and a data entry section, and
Mhm.
clerical, different units. We had quite a research unit with from 20 to 30 inmates doing that work for a while, and did that project, which gave us a quite substantial staff because we were only allowed to pay those guys $7 a month.
Mhm. So that was actually the first research division in the Department of Corrections in California?
The research division that I joined earlier was. Then this was just a grant-funded unit for an organization called the Institute for the Study of Crime and Delinquency.
Mhm.
I mean, that's who the grant was through.
Mhm.
It's now called the American Justice Institute, which was headed by a gentleman named Richard McGee, who's quite prominent corrections leader
Mhm.
then, and important in the history of corrections.
Mhm.
And it's only due to McGee, of course, that we were able to have that research unit with those inmates working on this way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Who were some of the other people who were working in that Department of Corrections early on or over in Vacaville where it's
Well, a notable one that would be known to you was really a consultant, and that's Leslie Wilkins. Doug was looking around for what consultant help, would really be useful in establishing a division, and a famous psychologist by the name of Lee Kronbach had advised Doug that there was this guy in England in the Home Office, who's Deputy Director of Research in the Home Office, who Kronbach said was about 20 years of his time, 20 years ahead of his time,
Mhm.
which is quite a remarkable statement from Lee Kronbach,
Yes, it
who
is.
himself is about 30 years of his time, ahead of his time at all times.
Mhm.
So that was quite a remarkable recommendation, and Doug got Leslie to come over for a stay, and I had the chance and the pleasure to work then with Leslie on a project for a couple of years while he
Mhm.
stayed here in England.
Mhm. What was the result of that project? Is that
Mainly we were
action?
involved in a prediction study. Leslie, together with Herman Mannheim, had not too long before published a book. In fact, the book publication date is 1955, called Prediction Methods in Relation to Borstal Training. And he'd done some prediction studies there, which, he had used the then more modern methods, multivariate analyses to make prediction studies, which was was novel at the time.
Mhm.
But more interesting, actually, was that he had tried to use these in what we now would call a quasi-experimental design manner. They didn't call it that, but that's what he did. He was comparing what they called open and closed borstal institutions while controlling for the risk of later violation,
Mhm.
you know, and taking that into account in the comparison. Well, that was very interesting to us because we wanted to develop prediction methods mainly for the purpose of assisting in program evaluation studies.
Mhm.
So that's why we got involved in the prediction study and
Mhm.
made a prediction tool, various versions, but it was called base expectancy.
Mhm.
The reason for calling it a base expectancy measure was that this would give us an expectation absent treatment.
Mhm. Could you describe that base expectancy a little bit?
The conceptualization?
Yes.
Well, and using it as a tool in that
Mhm.
way? Well, yeah. The idea would be that if you can predict the outcome of treatment before the treatment,
Mhm.
and regardless of the treatment, it's very hard to argue for the effectiveness of the treatment.
Mhm.
If, on the other hand, you find that there's some variability in the outcome that you can't explain by what's known before treatment, then, you know, you have a reasonable suspicion that maybe something's going on due to treatment, at least enough to help you center your resources then, using an experimental design probably, to try to tie down whether there is indeed a treatment effect.
Mhm.
And I think that's really still a very sound, you know, method. We know now and didn't know then that you really ought to control also for additional selection factors that enter into the decision of the person making the placement.
Mhm.
But we know there's a very good case to be made that if you can get a good measure of a priori risk, which is base expectancy in our language then, and the other selection factors, control for those effectively in a multivariate analysis, you usually can wipe out all the variability, but not always. And this is a sound method, I think, for organizations to use, such as correctional systems, juvenile justice systems, and so forth, as a routine manner.
Mhm.
So that's what we were about then. It's never been achieved yet, but still I think is a worthy goal. It's clearly much more achievable now than it was then because we have all this speedy technology.
Now, this is a period in which statistical techniques are starting to supplement or take over from clinical judgments. This is a fairly important period in criminology.
At the time that we were doing that,
Yes.
At that time, not a very good case can be made that they were very much used in making individual decisions. In fact, we didn't argue, you know, for them or that decisions should be made that way. As I say, our main interest was in developing a research tool. We found it was also a very useful program planning tool. Because you do want to have different programs for different risk groups. And well, for example, we developed ways of classifying parolees according to risk with differential caseloads. Well, this was a long time ago. It's done all the time now, but that was kind of novel at the time. So we thought of it also as a planning tool and a research tool more than assistance in decisions.
Now, you mentioned this is a time before high-speed computers.
Very much so. To do those analyses you're talking about, I used to load up a suitcase full of IBM punch cards, Hollerith cards, they're called even earlier. Load them in my suitcase, get on the airplane in Sacramento, go to UCLA, the Western Data Processing Center, do my analysis, and go home at night. I can do the same analysis now at home on my computer in about 5 seconds. So
Now,
that's order of magnitude difference.
so these base expectancies were first developed while you were working at Vacaville?
No, in Department of Corrections,
Department of
Research
Corrections.
Division.
And you have some subsequent information about those base expectancies, don't you? Did you recently follow up, revalidate those?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about
yeah.
that.
Well, your brother Steve and I recently did look at follow-ups that we obtained over 20 years or so for those offenders. And in terms of validity, the validity is the same as it was with the 2-year follow-up, roughly. You have many more failures, but the slope of the line doesn't change.
That's pretty remarkable.
And
Pretty good validation, 20 years later.
yeah, it's a pretty long follow-up.
Yeah. So with your initial contact with Leslie Wilkins was there at the Department of Corrections.
Yes, it was.
You mentioned that he was there just for a short period of time.
A few months,
Few months?
at least. Yeah, I can't recall, but maybe 5-6 months.
And you didn't stay there too long. You then moved to
To Vacaville, so on
Vacaville.
this grant that I had received. Yeah.
and subsequent to Vacaville, the National Council on Crime and Delinquency.
That's right.
How did
yeah.
that
Well,
get started?
I began working with your Professor Vincent O'Leary. He wasn't at Albany at the time. He was running a series of programs of training for parole board members, training about decision making, and he kept calling me in as a consultant. You know, part of the program, which is usually a week-long program. So I got involved with parole through Vince, and he and I together somehow came up with the idea that we had a good opportunity with these parole board members of doing several things that would help them develop methods in their own units of looking at the data that they have about parole and parole follow-up and so forth. And since we had a number of different states involved, of getting states to work together with uniform definitions, develop a nationwide system of uniform parole reporting. So we embarked on that as part of Vince's program, but I went running back to NIMH again and got a grant to do that program. It was called Uniform Parole Reports. And we did that, funded first by NIMH and later by the Department of Justice, for probably 6 or 8 years.
So the idea was to get all of the paroling authorities in the United States to use common definitions of terms and collect the statistics in a comparable way.
Exactly right. And we did that.
You did that.
We did that. And we didn't have all cases for all states, and we didn't have contributions from everyone, but we had all states agreeing to collaborate. We had data from most states, and Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands, American Virgin Islands.
And those data ultimately became the source for the 4,000 Lifetimes project?
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people think that title is about 4,000 subjects, but it's something like 100,000 subjects. But the time they had served in the study would be equivalent to about 4,000 lifetimes.
Probably the largest recidivism study done, you think?
In terms of numbers of cases involved, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I would not. Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about those early days in the Department of Corrections, that research division, is actually quite a large number of people who subsequently became well known in criminology. Did Rita Warren have a affiliation with the Department of Corrections at the time?
Rita was Rita was working in the Youth Authority, which was about the same thing. There's 2 separate units, but we were in one building there. Rita and Doug were married at the time. Her name was Rita Grant when I first met Rita Warren, and they had been working on the theory of interpersonal maturity at Camp Elliott in the Navy, and had carried that into corrections. And as you know, it became a very important thing in the California Youth Authority and nationally for a period of time.
The I-level classification.
The I-level classification, exactly. So that by the time President Johnson made his one of his first speeches after inauguration as president, he mentioned that study as one of the hopes
Oh, is that right?
in corrections, because the demonstration of the effectiveness of treatment, you did it differentially. Of course, as time went on and the rehabilitation balloon that had risen during the period we were speaking about popped, that sort of work became much into disfavor. And as you very well know, Rita went to State University of New York at Albany, where
That's right.
she carried the torch
Yes, you did.
with many students around the country
Yes.
still working in that area.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you meet someone now who knows about the eye level theory, chances are good they came from Albany.
That's probably right, yeah. Now, I think Hans Toke was also somehow affiliated with...
Hans was there working
Uh-huh.
with Doug, and we were in the same institution, but not on the same project.
Mhm.
Hans and Doug were working on a project at that moment called New Careers for Offenders.
Mhm.
And the idea was to take an assortment of offenders, quite miscellaneous assortment, and train them to do social research and change them into change agents and get them to help change the system.
Uh-huh.
And they did that quite successfully.
Mhm.
And it's not a very well-known thing. It was a quite successful project. With a little bit of time and research, I could dig up the names of at least a dozen or 15 graduates of that program who went on to do considerably important things
Mhm.
in the field of criminal justice.
Uh-huh. And Hans's book, Violent Men, was that
Started about that time,
started
or
about
later.
that time? Was that done at it was at Vacaville, was it?
I expect his interviews were done at Vacaville. I'm not certain of that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got to have lunch with Hans often,
Uh-huh.
although we work in different areas. And he was trying to make change agents out of the inmates as his project. He and
Mhm.
Doug were. We were over here in the same institution. We were getting inmates to do work for us,
Mhm.
but I believe it amounted about the same thing.
Uh-huh.
That we didn't know it. We were developing change agents too.
Uh-huh.
They went on to do similar things to Doug's and
Uh-huh.
Hans's folks because they got involved in research in this area,
Mhm.
and they stuck with it.
Now, you directed the research center for the National Council on Crime and Delinquency for quite a number of years.
Yeah, that developed really out of that Uniform Parole Reports project.
Mhm.
We just started doing more other things and decided that NCCD needed to have a research center,
Uh-huh.
and so we built it in that way.
Well, why did you build it where you built it?
In Davis?
Yeah.
Living there?
You were living there and said, well, might
Why
as well
not?
throw out the shingle here.
Yeah,
Is that right?
about it, yeah.
Uh-huh. You worked on the important paper that you wrote was written for the President's Crime Commission. So it's a little bit later. How did you get involved with that?
I don't recall who invited me to write that paper. Someone working on the Crime Commission. Vince would be a reasonable suspect because he was down there in D.C., spending time in D.C. working on the Crime Commission.
Uh-huh.
But others, I've forgotten who invited me. Somebody asked me to write on that topic,
Uh-huh.
and so I did that.
It's interesting that that you're very well known for statistical methods in prediction, and but yet you started with, in part, a clinical background. Did you always have an interest in statistics and mathematics?
No.
Just
No, and some people think that I have a background in statistics. I don't.
Mhm.
I can talk to a statistician, and I can talk with a statistician on a few topics, especially if they're an applied statistician.
Mhm.
But I'm not a statistician.
Mhm. But subsequent to the publication of that paper, I think it's fair to say that prediction methods became very standard instruments throughout the United States. Is that your?
Well, yes, post hoc ergo propter hoc.
Uh-huh.
No, that's true. What you said is true.
right. But you wouldn't attribute causality to it.
Absolutely not.
Of course, you have funny views about causation, don't you?
In your view, I have funny views about causation because I know that you think cause is a very useful concept, and it is. You're probably right. I have a lot of philosophic difficulty with the concept of cause, yeah. I think that we sort of know if, then.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous poem that you know about. It starts out that way, if, then, this only I assert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll drop that for the moment and pursue
Good idea.
pursue some other topics.
Good idea.
Stand by.